This video is recorded in English. Please use the subtitles. Voor de Nederlandse kijkers, zet de ondertitels aan en leer hoe je met deze kousstempels van Carla Creaties kunt werken en hoe je inkleurt met Nuvo Shimmer powders. Ik deel heel veel tips, ook over heat embossen, dus kijk tot het einde om niks te missen. Hello, it's CisVolk. Time to enjoy card making with me. In a short video I made this cute card with the Carla Creaties Kous collection and Nuvo Shimmer powders. This video was too short to explain everything I wanted to share, and therefore I will make a new similar card and show you how to use these funny cows, how to mask the stamps and color them with Nuvo Shimmer powders. Also, I have lots of tips about stamping, masking, coloring and heat embossing. So listen and watch and turn on the subtitles so you don't miss a thing. Here are two of the cow's clear stamps. You see, this cow has flowers on her head, but on the stamp there are not any, so you can add them if you like, by layering or by masking, or leave them out if you want. I will show you how in this video. Instead of flowers, I added a hat on her head. It is on the cow's forehead, and I also added this flower. A similar flower is in the basics doodle set, but that one is a bit smaller. The bigger one has extra shading lines in the petals, but you could also use that smaller flower if you want. The doodles are very useful to add on all cards. The text Moveless is on the new Cow's 5 stamp, and also you are how old? If you follow me, you know I always make a matching envelope, and I will share tips for that as well. I will make a similar card using this stamp and will use the bow. Using only the bow is easier than the head with the flower. As I said, I will use Nuvo Shimmer powders for the background, but also for the coloring of the cow I will use black powder, storm cloud, and I used cherry bomb, falling leaves and blue blitz for the new card. On this first card I didn't use pink but fantail firecracker. Also on the nose I used that color on top of a base layer of distress ink. The next card will have a pink bow, so I will match the nose of the cow in the same color. I use CraftEmotions 200 grams watercolor card paper. It is very handy and fine, smooth watercolor paper, and I use it all the time. I like to stamp with VersaFine ink to make a nice crisp black impression, and I heat emboss that with Ranger clear embossing powder. It makes watercoloring much easier to stay within the lines. And watercoloring I like to do best with a water brush. My favorite at the moment is the Derwent No. 2 water brush. As you can see, it has a very fine tip, so you can also make tiny lines with it if you need. And it is big enough to color larger areas. Let's get started. For my base card I use white CraftEmotions cardstock. Easy to use for a square card. It is 13.5 by 27 cm. If you fold it in half, it is 13.5 cm square. I will add all information in the descriptions of the video. Because my base card is 13.5 cm square, I also will make my card panel a square size. And because I want a small border around it, I will cut it 13 cm square. This is the CraftEmotions 200 grams watercolor card paper. I want to stamp the cow with the bow on its head. Objects that must be on the front, so closest to you, must be stamped first. In this case, the bow must be stamped first. I already placed the cow on a clear block. The bow I will stick to a clear block later. I now place it like this so I can see through it and adjust the place where to position it. Now I leave the bow in place and stick it to a clear block. We must remember where to stamp the bow to keep the whole image centered on the card panel. A good tip for it is to add a few marks with a pencil to the paper at the edges of the clear block. These marks will help us see where to stamp and we can easily erase them later. Before stamping on the card, we will have to make some masks first. And for that I use CraftEmotions masking tape. When you make a mask, better stamp with a fast drying ink. So don't use VersaFine ink. It will take too long to dry and you will get inky fingers and smudges. Better use Memento water-based ink or archival ink. The color and quality of the impression does not matter. It is enough if you can see where to cut. I start by making a mask of the bow. And I also make a mask of the cow. A mask of the bow is necessary because we don't want to see the head peek through. A mask of the cow is necessary so we can make a nice background around the cow without coloring the cow in the wrong colors. I start stamping and masking the bow because the bow is most to the front. Here we don't want to see stamping lines from the cow's head shining through. The cow's head is much larger than the masking paper. That's no problem. The lower part of the head we will just stamp again on a clean part of the masking paper. Everything will be cut out anyway and we can stick the pieces on top and next to each other anyway. So it does not matter if the masks are made out of one or more pieces. I want to clean the plate first. I don't want any mess on the back of the papers or on my fingers. Because I stamped the mask with another kind of ink than the ink I will use next, I clean them quickly in between. First I stamp most of the ink off on a spare piece of paper and next I rub it off on a damp microfiber cloth. This step is not necessary if you use the same ink for the mask and for the actual image like archival or hybrid ink. When cutting the mask, you want to touch the sticky side as little as possible. Also, don't use cream or anything like oil on your fingers. You will lose the stickiness. When cutting a mask, you cut on top of the black line, not above and not below. When cutting the mask when it is only for this watercolor background, it is not a big deal if the cutting is not done perfectly. We can add color on white spots afterwards, so cutting the mask for each and every hair on the chin or head is not necessary. I keep the cut line outside of the hairs. The same counts for the hair on top of the cow's head. Cut on the outside of the hair so the image stays clean. You can make a few extra cuts, but don't bother if it is not perfect. With Nuvo Shimmer powder it is not a big deal. It would be when you will be doing some ink blending though. That is because with ink blending you want a smooth background. You cannot add color in with a brush, while you can with a sprayed or watercolored background. Before we do the heat embossing, we want to make the paper anti-static with an embossing pouch. The powder in it will cover any grease or fingerprints that can cause the powder to stick in places where we don't want it. I knock or blow off the excess powder. When you blow, don't spit on it accidentally, because on places where it gets wet, embossing powder will stick. Now it's time to stamp the bow in VersaFine ink. Ink up the stamp, but don't press too hard. It looks like I press hard because of that shaking, but it is just tapping. Because I added the pencil marks, I still know where to stamp the bow. Press flat and strong and don't wiggle for a perfect impression. This ink will remain wet for a few minutes, so we can apply embossing powder on top of it. I'm using my two wrinkly tracing papers for a long time now, and they work perfect for me. They will catch all embossing powder and are smooth and light-weighted, thus easy to catch all powder. You can use two of them underneath each other to catch powder that is spilled. This way you can easily pick the powder up and apply the powder again on the stamped image to have even more coverage of the embossing powder. And these papers are of course ideal to funnel the embossing powder back into the jar. You could use a coffee filter or normal printer paper. I think vellum and tracing papers or parchment papers will work best, because the embossing powder does not stick to them easily and because they bend easily. Put the lid back on the jar immediately after use. So this combination I like best. VersaFine Onyx Black ink and Ranger clear embossing powder. Before heating this up, blow over the paper so loose embossing powder grains can now be blown away. And however this is clear embossing powder and you don't see it anyway, you will see it once the ink goes on top. Make sure the heat tool is heated up very well before you aim it to the paper. Would the heat tool not be hot enough, it would only blow away some grains, and you also might need to aim too long, which would cause some grains to sink into the paper. So be patient, wait 30 seconds, then aim at the stamp with powder on it and see the magic happen. Now some more patience. The embossing powder has just been melted and is now still warm. It needs to cool down a little bit before you can lay the mask layer on top of it. Now is a good moment to erase the pencil marks. Our first layer is the bow. My mask won't stick on this well enough, and that is because I treated the paper with anti-static powder. So that will have to be wiped off first. Using a clean microfiber cloth, you can easily remove the powder. This is also a good tip when you use colored paper. The chalky color cast can be wiped off this way. Now my bow mask will stick. On top of this there will be the cow. It probably is not necessary, but to be sure I will now again add some talcum powder. You never know. Blow off the excess. Ink up the stamp really good. Now aim for the best spot to stamp the cow. I look where the horn fits the middle of the bow. And I check if the eye is not completely covered by the mask below. You can of course also use a stamp platform for it. That might make it a bit easier. Now we again apply a layer of clear embossing powder. For me, embossing powder is best to easily color between the lines, especially when you are coloring with watercolors. I apply the powder 2 times and have it fall off on different sides, so I am sure there is a good coverage. Notice that the yellow mask is still on top. Would I have pulled off the mask before adding the embossing powder, the powder would also stick to the remains of where the mask has been sitting. Despite the embossing pouch, there can be a spot where you still see unwanted powder stick. These are easily removed with a small brush. Next step is to remove the mask. Be gentle to not touch the embossing powder. I like to use some tweezers to help me remove that mask. Now we can melt the powder. Only heat and melt the powder on the cow and prevent reheating the bow again. Where I am close to the bow, I take some more distance. These are the basics texts. They have 2 fonts that combine very well together. The cow is smiling so cute, which is why I like this text to match it. Always start your day with a smile. And yes, the stamps are quite sticky. This can be annoying when you want to lay them on the correct spot. But having them so sticky has more advantages than disadvantages. They are a very good quality. I want another large sentiment to go together with this. Congratulations would be perfect. Or just marvelous, baby. Marvelous. First let's check if what I have in mind will fit. I think they both fit. Congratulations, start your day with a smile. That's possible, isn't it? The word congratulations is connected to the sentence below. I could mask it off, but I'm sure I will use that big congratulations more often, so I will cut it off. As long as I cut in between the raised parts, there's no problem. If I want to stamp them together, I can stick them onto my clear block and have them fit together again. Cutting did not go well with my precision scissors. You see, it does cut better with these non-stick scissors. This is the most trickiest part, but when I bend the stamp, I can precisely cut in between the text. I place the text in the right position on the watercolor cardstock. You could do this in a stamp positioner as well, but with Versamark ink and using a glass mat underneath, for me this is more quick. And I rely on the lines of my clear block to stamp straight. If you are not sure, do use a stamp platform. If you aren't sure yet about the text, or you want to add the text in 3D with foam squares, you can still add the text after coloring. Use the embossing pouch again before stamping. The resin on the new stamps and fingerprints from your fingers added new grease marks. The reason why I stamp and heat emboss the text before adding ink is because I now see better where I want to have ink and where not so much. I now check the lines on my clear block and the edge of the paper to see if they align on the left and bottom, so I can be sure I stamp straight. Press long and even and lift the stamp upwards. Notice that I add the powder in different directions to the paper, so all ink is covered with powder. Better not funnel the powder directly from the card into the container. That small jar has a treated edge. That will collect powder and that will fall back onto your desk or gets on your fingers. Maybe that's also a reason that some people say that everything is covered with embossing powder. You can use a big brush and collect all embossing powder from your glass mat or desk onto a piece of paper and throw away when dirty or funnel it back into the jar. As I said earlier, don't heat too long at the same spot. You can also heat the paper from the back or do it alternately. That is recommended with sensitive papers like vellum. When you see all the powder turned from matte into glossy, you know everything is embossed. When the powder is not bulging, you might have given it too much heat. My small letter A is not glossy enough. It needs some more heat. Just a second. So now you know all my tips about heat embossing. Now we will be giving color to the background. At first we will protect the cow and the bow with the masking paper. That embossing powder is still on that bow. I remove that and again wipe the paper with a microfiber cloth to remove powders for a better adhesive of the masking paper. I will place the bow on first, but it can also be placed on top. At the moment the order is not important. I prefer to stick smaller parts first and larger second, so they stick better. That is also why I lift up the upper lip and stick the mask of the lower part of the beak underneath. And using tweezers is a must, because it not only helps being more precise where you stick the mask, but also keeps the stickiness. For this example, while using with Nuvo Shimmer powders, it is not that extremely important that you cut the mask very precise and that you stick it down very precise, because you can still add some ink around the figure later. Stick it down very well. Now we can finally go to work with the powders. I don't know if you know them already and worked with them, but I'm sure that I give you new insights in how to use them and have fun with these pigmented and shimmery powders. I lightly tap on the bottles to get a minimum amount of powder on the paper. Both the colors Blue Blitz and Green Falling Leaves I apply to the card panel. You can also do one color, but adding a second color gives more depth and contrast. As you see, I have a big blob of powder in that corner and there is some powder on top of the text. And I don't want too much color at the edges of the paper, nor much around the text. These pigment powder grains are hardly visible. There is no ink needed on the mask. I spread that powder to the paper. I also spread big clumps of powder and wipe the powder from the edge of the paper to the middle, near the edge of the mask. I also wipe a bit of powder off the bristles and try to wipe powders from the text part a bit more upwards. However, there still will be pigment on the paper. It is hardly visible, but there is for sure. There is an effective way to erase these particles. Using a kneading eraser, you can easily wipe around the edges and around the text area, where you want to keep a white border or edge. You won't be able to remove everything anyway, simply because you can't see as clearly what you're doing. But that's just my point. If I would have wanted it all to be perfectly white, I would have masked it off. However, a masked border is straight and I want a more playful effect. Some grains will give color, but there will not be much at the borders, which is perfect. So keep in mind this kneading eraser tip. Now we will add water to the paper, and that's where more magic happens. You can spray with any sprayer you have. The difference with each sprayer will be visible. Some sprayers will give more water than others, or some have a jet that is too hard or can have big droplets. Try out on a scrap first. Having a mist sprayer is best for these powders. You can apply as many water as you like, but be aware that the more water you add, the more colors will mix and the more water will run. You see that the kneading eraser did its job. There are still a few inky spots around the borders, but not so very much. And this is just the effect I was looking for. I want the water and most pigment parts to run to the middle of the paper. Normally I would just let this sit and wait for some time to dry. And that is the best thing to do for the nicest result. On my finished card you see what it looks like if you let it air dry. If you let it air dry, the pigment is not moved by the heat tool and you can see much more color speckles. With a water brush or other brush for watercolor painting, you can move the color closer to the mask or to another place if you need some pigment in places where there is not enough. Do it sparingly. You will like the effect when dry. No card will be the same. That's the beauty of these powders. I am not patient at the moment to wait for the paper to dry, so I will carefully dry it with the heat tool. You will see what happens when you use the heat tool for drying. The powder and water droplets will run. When heating the paper, we have to avoid heating the mask. We don't want to melt the embossing powder and have it stick to the mask, so you lose all dimension from the embossing powder. When drying with the heat tool, you get a different effect. You see all water puddles forming. I personally don't like them. But now you know that you can dry the paper with the heat tool to get this effect if you like it. Fortunately, you can still keep adding powders and water, and do if you are not satisfied. But again, remember that best results you get when you spray and walk away. When it's dry, we can remove the mask. And now we can color that funny cow. Before coloring, clean your surface. There are still some invisible pigments on your desk, and they can interact easily with the colors you are picking up. You can see how many color was on my plate. So better be safe and clean it up. Using a little bit of powder is enough to color that cow. This is Storm Cloud, and for the bow I will use Cherry Bomb. For the coloring I use the Derwent water brush number 2. The highly pigmented powders can affect the colors of your bristles, but I don't mind that. Keep a jar of water nearby to rinse the water brush in, and use a piece of kitchen paper to clean and dry the water brush. For coloring we need a wet but not too wet and dry but not too dry brush. We will start by coloring the bow. Dip the tip of the brush a tiny bit into the pile of powder. You see that is a very tiny amount. Now start coloring at the place that you know will be the darkest spot. Mostly at places where there must be shadow. If you start at these spots, you know for sure that if you have too much pigment, you can always dilute it with water. You see, when the ink gets less pigmented, you dip in the powder again and continue to add color to shaded spots on your image. While you are coloring, water from the water brush seeps to the bristles and mixes with the ink, which dilutes the ink. You see that the ink gets lighter. Now we can add color to the white parts by coloring them and spreading the ink from the darker parts partly to the lighter parts. Depending on where you need color or shading, you wipe from light to dark or from dark to light. And see how few powder you need. This pile of powder is way too much. Spread the darker areas out. Then wipe the brush or even clean it, and then spread from light to dark to lighten the lighter parts and have a nicer blend. Meanwhile, this first layer has dried quickly and we can add a new layer for more pigment or more contrast. You can keep adding new layers as much as you like. The colors blend together very easily. I will do some pink in her ear. You see that pink is too bright for an ear, and for the cow's snout we will have to mix another color in to dull it down. Tattered Rose Distress Ink is a nice skin color to use. This is a nice color to use as a base for that snout. Now we need a more diluted pink from the pigment powders, and you see that I take a little bit of powder and have that mixed with the water that comes out of my water brush. You see that this is a light shade now and it mixes great with the distress ink underneath. Again, less water and more powder on spots where shading is needed. Now we want to have a little bit of grey for shadows. Mix a lot of water with the pigment. Again, start on places where there are dark spots. And if you are not sure where to color, you can look at the example Carla colored, or just look for a cow on the internet. The pigment powders have all different color grains in them to create that beautiful effect. If you dip your brush in the powder in a certain color, the tint is different every time. That is that awesome effect that you get over and over again. achieve more dimension in the image, I add a shadow line around the lower parts of the bow. Again, I use diluted black shimmer powder for this. Thin layers of small stripes give a hairy effect. You can keep adding new layers to make the image as vibrant as you want. I add extra pigmented stripes to the bow to add more texture and vibrancy. See my two images here at the side to see the difference. Adding highlights with a white acrylic marker or white gel pen is the next step to make. I will add cuteness by adding 3 dots on the cheeks. I add a line on the curves of the nostrils. Anything that sticks out or catches the light will get some white highlight. That also counts for the tongue and teeth. And now I see I forgot to color that lower lip. I also add highlights in the bow and I can add many more, but I leave it like this. I have more tips to share with you and I'll show them when coloring the envelope. If you have a somewhat thinner quality envelope, you can't just start coloring with water on it. It is helpful if you stick a piece of paper on it. The piece of paper I use is smooth 120 gram paper, so that is thin. I make it anti-static and emboss crisscross some bows on it. It is nice if part of the card is reflected on the envelope. You stamp the bows crisscross with about equal spacing between them. And you rotate them a bit each time so that no one bow is pointing in the same direction. You also make sure the bows fall over the edges of the paper. Again, add clear embossing powder on top. This is optional. You can certainly do this without. Wipe spilled powder off your plate with a brush. I have to be careful because there's still shimmer powder on my plate as well. For such a fully stamped paper, using a magnet is very convenient. I won't burn my fingers holding the paper. And the paper won't curl up easily. And the powder will melt quicker. Because the heat from the heat tool will also heat the backing of the paper through the glass mat. For this piece of paper I don't have enough patience to make a lot of bow masks. But I do want to make a nice background. What you can do is put some colors you need for the background on your glass mat. In this envelope example I used the same blue and green as I did for the card. Take a dry brush and dip that brush in these 2 piles of powder. Be sure that brush is dry and clean. Now color, so to say, with that brush, on places where you need color. In my case that is in between these bows. Take notice that you don't have some powder sprinkle or fall on top of these bows. If it is necessary, you can of course use that mask again. This way you will have a better and precise coverage. But I want to make a quick paper piece. And I'm seriously not in the mood to cut out 6 or more bows. You will see that this method is an option. For some bows I use the one and only mask I have and I repositioned it to be able to brush closer to the edge of the bow. You don't need much powder for a nice effect. It is hardly visible. Because we have these embossed lines, you will see the water I will spray will be contained behind the lines. And if there is a spot where you think, oh, there is powder there, you can always remove it with a kneading eraser. Now I have an old one in use for this that has dried out quite a bit. I occasionally wet it and then I knead it a little more smoothly. It still works fine because of that. What's also handy is that you can make a tip on it by kneading it. This way I check a few bows just to be sure. And now we can spray water over it. I cover up the glass mat with a paper towel to not have ink everywhere. Because this is no watercolor paper and the paper is quite thin, we only want to mist it. I use a tiny mister for that. There are some spots that failed, but I can color over it and I can cut off part that I won't be using. Now this will have to dry, and now you can color these bows in the same way as you did on the cow. With the only difference being that this is very thin paper, so you have to color very dry. The least amount of water will darken the paper and it can cause the paper to tear. This thin paper is warped as it dried up. That does not matter. You can roll it a few times through an embossing machine, or just lay it flat under a pile of books or something heavy like that same embossing machine. And the next day you will be fine and can stick it onto an envelope or even a card. You see that I color a bit faster and try not to color much on the same spot. Use a very light amount of water. Using some diluted black ink, you can now add some shadows around the bottom of the bows so they will pop up more. Do every bottom part, even if the bow is turned. See how this gives a lot more interest? More interest will be achieved when adding highlights. These few stripes will add light and structure to the bows. Don't think about it too much. When you do this more often, you don't have to think about it anymore. And just copy the places where I add highlights and look closely how others add them to their colored stamps. This one we will cut some smaller and glue to the envelope. Using double-sided tape prevents the paper from bulging. Keep one last side to cut off later. You now are sure that the envelope is covered on all edges. The card can now be assembled. Let's give it a black paper border. If you don't feel like measuring and cutting at the millimeter, this way is something for you. Put a black piece of paper on the card base and keep a small even border at the top and bottom. Then draw a pencil mark at the right and at the bottom. Now you can cut this black paper exactly on that pencil mark spot, if you can still find where they are. This fits exactly. Now the colored card panel can go on top, but it is still too wide to fit. It needs some fine trimming on two sides. The card panel can now be glued to the black backing and next to the card panel. I use double-sided tape to be sure that the card base won't bulge. If you only peel off the corners of the tape, you will be able to still slide a little before you glue it down. This is a technique I do for a long time now, and it always works as long as you don't peel off the tape backing completely. You peel off the corners a little and fold them over. The one in the middle has to go completely. If that's a problem, and that is mostly for heavier cardstock or larger cards, then there is an alternative way, which I've shown earlier in another video. It would be nice if the envelope also gets a black border. Let's dig in my scraps and add a thin one. For such things, keeping scraps is perfect. For having enough space in your craft room, it is a disaster. Here is the completed card and envelope. The envelope turned out great with that matching black border and matching colors. The shadows around the bows make them stand out more. The cow is so funny. I immediately want to make another one. With this masking technique, you can combine lots of other stamps with it. You can see the embossing powder shine, and also the shimmer powder shines. I love that. I will also show the first card I made. You can see how I made that one in my reel on Instagram. I will link to that reel below in the description. Here I masked off all flowers, added some more powders and did not have the idea to add that same black border. Maybe I will do that later on. Here you see that cow. This one I masked using the flower and the head. Remember that I did not heat the powder for this card to let it dry. On the first card I made in my reel, I let it all dry by air. Maybe I also used less water on the right one. You see that the left one with heat tool has more puddles of water that went moving around the paper, where on the right one, that air dried, has more pigment spots. So this was my inspiration for today. Let me know what you found most interesting and what you would like to see in the future from me. You can find product links in the description of the video. More inspiration for Carla Creaties I share on my Facebook, Pinterest and Instagram pages. Thank you for watching. Thanks for the thumbs up and I will see you next time. Bye bye!